Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. This week, we continue our special series of features. We're taking an in-depth look at the most significant and divisive stories we've covered and the media's role in reporting on those people and places. On this edition,
burning at the stake is torture. Boiling in oil is torture.
The U.S. media and the double standard that exists when covering the so-called war on terror.
The problem with this story was that it was just flatly inaccurate.
From the detention of U.S. journalists versus their foreign counterparts to the treatment of prisoners held in American jails abroad, there has been a distinct lack of consistency in what stateside news outlets have been reporting and a lack of confidence in their coverage as a result. We're getting started with the great torture debate, President Barack Obama's willingness to suppress certain images and the American media's reticence in even using the word torture.
We could have a long argument about what torture is.
Prisoner abuse.
Rough treatment of some al-Qaeda suspects.
One of the first lessons reporters are ever taught in Journalism 101 is to consider the source. In the torture debate, the primary source on waterboarding was the Bush administration, which authorized it and said it was not torture.
The techniques were necessary and are necessary to be used on a rare occasion to get information necessary to protect the American people.
Then came the Obama administration, which calls waterboarding torture and has therefore banned it.
Waterboarding violates our ideals and our values. I do believe that it is torture.
So where does that leave the media?
Traditionally, what the media does is it looks at a definition, sees whose interest it's in to use that definition, then finds out whether the facts of the case meet that definition.
In this case, the experts on interrogation are the people who interrogate. If you go to those interrogators and you ask them, do these techniques work? Are they torture? Overwhelmingly, you hear the same thing. Yes, waterboarding, these extreme tactics are torture. But for some reason, in this debate, the media, doesn't do that. They trust the word of politicians with virtually no experience in any of this to make the case that this isn't torture. It really does a disservice to the debate and skews it in a way to make it unintelligible.
Certainly one help in defining what is and what is not torture is the Red Cross, which looked into a lot of the activity at the rendition sites and claimed that by their definition that this indeed was torture. And it seems to me if anybody is in a position to dispassionately adjudicate whether something is or is not torture, the Red Cross has a long history at being able to do so.
What is stopping so many American news outlets from using the T word? Part of it comes down to the editorial policy of the country's most influential newspaper.
All journalists still take their cues from the New York Times. At first, they called them harsh interrogation techniques. They changed the term that they use to brutal interrogation techniques, which is a little stronger, but they still don't refer to it as torture. What they'll often say is what some people call torture. They'll find different ways like that to get the word in without calling it.
The Times has actually written about the issue. Its public editor, Clark Hoyt, quoted the Times' Washington editor, Douglas Gell, who said, "Exactly what constitutes torture continues to be a matter of debate and hasn't been resolved by a court." This president and this attorney general say waterboarding is torture, but the previous president and attorney general said it is not. On what basis should a newspaper render its own verdict, short of charges being filed or a legal judgment being rendered? That line of argument resulted in waves of criticism, including this acidic response in a letter to the editor. The Times would not call bank robbery a brutal cash-gathering technique, even if a president said it was so.
This is the main problem with the U.S. media, is that we've got a media system that is run, for the most part, at the commercial levels by people who are afraid to challenge power, take the gloves off, and really find out what's happening. Hopefully we'll see some changes as the media landscape in the United States divests from the mainstream major networks, moves online, and we see more independent critical voices.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
Barack Obama knows that America's torturing of prisoners is a big issue in the Arab and Muslim worlds. That's why he raised it in Cairo.
We are taking concrete actions to change course. I have unequivocally prohibited the use of torture by the United States, and I have ordered the prison at Guantanamo Bay closed by early next year.
President Obama didn't just ban torture. He ordered his Justice Department to release a series of memos that detailed what U.S. interrogators had done, the waterboarding, and the rest of it. But memos and documents are one thing, pictures apparently are another.
There is something different about putting out a bunch of legal memos and putting out images, and that images resonate for the rest of the world. People that won't take the time to read a news article will see an image, and the image will shock them. And the image should shock them because what happened is shocking.
Very senior Pentagon source tells me these photographs have been withheld. The 44 that Obama saw are nothing compared to the photographs that came out in 2004, 2006. But then other people have told me, no, they're very disturbing. They potentially could cause some serious backlash. But my understanding is that even inside the Pentagon, there was a very sharp difference of opinions on this.
And when one mainstream news outlet, Britain's Daily Telegraph, got involved, it got the story slightly wrong, reporting that some of the pictures at issue were taken at Abu Ghraib in Iraq, when they were actually from other prisons. In an expert piece of political counterspinning, the White House took the paper's relatively minor mistake and turned it into an attack on the entire British media.
Gibbs has taken the opportunity to jump all over the Telegraph and point out the fact that they're wrong. And yes,
the article is wrong and mischaracterizes the photos that are in question.
The Telegraph got it wrong. It conflates a number of issues. It confuses Abu Ghraib photos with these abuse photos that have not been released.
Gibbs seized upon that and their coinage to support his position, but you know, it's I would say it's seriously off focus. The question is, in fact, have they released everything?
The answer is no, they haven't, and they won't anytime soon. The reporting on torture, the impact of certain images in the news. The U.S. media celebrated the release of journalist Roxana Saberi from an Iranian prison in May of this year, but they're often silent about foreign reporters held by the U.S. Saberi's case raised questions about the disparity between the U.S. media's intense coverage of her story and that of journalists held without trial by Americans. U.S. prisons in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Guantanamo Bay have all housed journalists arrested and held without trial for prolonged periods. So where's the spotlight on their stories? The Listening Post's Salah Khadr now on the double standard that's often in play when the U.S. puts journalists behind bars and keeps them there.
Big news about our jailed U.S. journalist Roxana Saberi.
American journalist Roxana Saberi was released from prison in Iran.
An appeals court suspended Roxana Saberi's sentence.
I think the media campaign for Roxana Saberi had a tremendous impact.
It was used to show that the Iranian government is this oppressive and tyrannical government that disregards press freedom.
So it captured international attention. But what about the others?
The media love these kind of stories. Intrepid, not to mention attractive, American reporter released on appeal from an Iranian prison.
Her release may have come as a welcome surprise, but according to her father, Roxana never gave up hope.
Freedom for the reporter, chalk one up for freedom of the press, and cue the American media's in-house celebration.
Well, we've got some good news for you out of Iran, for a change. Journalist Roxana Saberi is now free.
Media watchdogs, though, like Glenn Greenwald at Salon.com, see the story another way.
It's really the American media that's intended to be the principal safeguard against abuses of power by the American government. And when the American media ignores the American government's oppressive actions, that not only is a profound failure of duty on the part of the American media, it is that, but I think even worse is it's deceitful and misleading.
Greenwald is talking about 3 cases where the US jailed foreign journalists, held them for much longer than the Iranians held Saberi, and never gave them a chance to defend themselves in court. Al Jazeera cameraman Sami El-Hajj was arrested in Pakistan, spent 6.5 years in US custody, most of it at Guantanamo Bay, and was never charged.
So why wasn't Sami El-Hajj given the attention of Roxana Saberi? Well, he just didn't fit the media narrative of the time, the war on terror.
Bilal Hussein, an Iraqi, is an award-winning Associated Press photographer, jailed by the Americans for 2 years in Iraq. He was also never charged.
Don't forget, imprisoning journalists without trial is an American policy. It was an American policy justified by the war on terrorism.
Ibrahim Jassam is still behind bars. He's a freelance Iraqi photographer who was working for Reuters. The US military has ignored an Iraqi court that ordered Jassam be released because of lack of evidence. He hasn't been charged either. Al-Hajj, Hussein and Jassam, all journalists jailed by the US, but for some reason their stories went relatively untold by the US media.
It's the story of a journalist who is accused of espionage.
I looked at how many mentions, media mentions, of Roxana Saberi there have been in the last 2 months since she was detained in Iran. And it exceeds the number of mentions in the American media of her name exceed 2,000. It's an extraordinary amount. And yet, for the first 6 years of Sami al-Hajj's detention, there were 101 references. The imprisonment of Bilal Hussein in Iraq had several hundred, and the current imprisonment of Ibrahim Jassam has a grand total of 71 mentions. And so what you see is a massive disparity.
Today, Roxana is a free woman.
In America, of course, they love their own. But for God's sake, don't imprison other people's, other journalists for long periods without trial, without any charges, and then ignore them altogether. And the media here is to blame.
Salah, Khadr reporting. When we come back, Pentagon leaks and front page blunders. We continue our look at the U.S. news media and the coverage of the so-called war on terror.